Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope you're having a wonderful day wherever you are in this vast world of ours. What time is it where you're reading this? Are you settling in for the evening, or perhaps stealing a moment during your lunch break? Whether you're in bustling Tokyo, quiet countryside England, the sprawling cities of America, or anywhere else on this spinning globe we call home, you're part of something special tonight. If you enjoy stories that make you question the very nature of reality itself, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. We explore the boundaries between the possible and impossible, the known and unknowable. Now let's begin our journey into a world where nothing is quite what it seems. Dr. Elias Rowe had always believed that the universe whispered its secrets to those patient enough to listen. What he hadn't expected was for it to start screaming. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, 12 years after the world was supposed to end. Elias sat in his cramped home laboratory, surrounded by towers of outdated equipment he'd salvaged from his former life at CERN. The digital clock on his desk read 11:11 a.m. So did his phone, and his laptop, and the microwave in the kitchen. Not unusual, he told himself. Clocks sync. Technology talks to itself now. But then the analogue wall clock, the one his wife Sarah had given him before she died in 2012, the one that had been running 3 minutes slow for over a decade, suddenly clicked forward 3 times in rapid succession. 11:11 exactly. Elias stared at the clock face, his coffee growing cold in his hands. In 30 years of studying theoretical physics, he had learned to distinguish between coincidence and impossibility. This was impossible. He spent the next hour documenting everything. Timestamps, photographs, video recordings. The scientific method had been his anchor since Sarah's death. The only thing that kept him tethered to a world that had felt increasingly unreal. But as he worked, more anomalies emerged. His particle detection equipment, normally registering random quantum fluctuations, began displaying patterns. Not the chaotic dance of subatomic particles he expected, but sequences, repetitions. At 1:11 p.m, every detector spiked simultaneously. At 2:22 p.m, they did it again. Elias pulled up his archived data from the past 6 months. The patterns were there, hidden in the noise, but undeniably present. Quantum events that should have been random were clustering around specific times. 11:11, 1:11, 2:22, 3:33. The probability of such synchronization occurring naturally was approximately 1 in 10 billion. That evening he sat in his darkened office staring at strings of numbers that shouldn't exist. Outside, the suburban street was quiet except for the occasional car passing under the streetlights. Everything appeared normal, but normality itself had become suspect. He opened his laptop and began searching for similar reports. What he found made his blood run cold. Online forums were filled with people reporting the same phenomenon, clocks synchronizing, digital displays showing repetitive numbers, but it went deeper than that. People were experiencing what they called glitches in the matrix, moments where reality seemed to stutter, repeat, or simply pause. A woman in Ohio described watching the same bird fly past her window 3 times in a row, following the exact same path. A man in Germany reported seeing the same car accident happen twice on his commute, with identical vehicles and identical outcomes. Hundreds of people across the globe were experiencing what they called missing time, hours that seemed to pass in minutes, or minutes that stretched into eternity. The phenomenon had a name, the Mandela effect, collective false memories of events that never happened, or happened differently than people remembered. But these weren't just confused recollections, they were specific, detailed, and shared by millions of people. Elias found himself falling down digital rabbit holes, reading testimonies from people who swore they remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, not in 2013. People who insisted that the Berenstain Bears were spelled with an E and not an A. People who claimed that entire countries had moved on maps, that famous movie quotes had changed, that the very fabric of reality had been altered. The rational part of his mind dismissed it as mass hysteria, shared delusions amplified by social media. But the physicist in him couldn't ignore the data. The synchronicities were real, the patterns were measurable, and they all seemed to cluster around one specific date, December 21st, 2012, the day the world was supposed to end. Elias had been at CERN that day, working on what would become his final project before Sarah's death drove him into isolation. He remembered the media frenzy about the Mayan calendar, the doomsday predictions, the collective sigh of relief when December 22nd arrived and the world continued spinning. But what if it hadn't? The thought struck him like a physical blow. He immediately dismissed it as grief-induced paranoia, but the idea wouldn't leave him alone. What if the world had ended on December 21st, 2012, and everything since then had been something else entirely? He spent the next week diving into archived data from that period. Official records showed nothing unusual. Background radiation levels normal, solar activity minimal, no cosmic events of significance. But Elias had access to sources that most people didn't. His former colleagues at CERN, NASA contacts from his postdoc days, researchers who owed him favours from decades of collaboration. What he found buried in retired servers and forgotten backup drives made his hands shake as he typed. On December 21st, 2012, at exactly 11:11 GMT, every satellite monitoring cosmic microwave background radiation had detected the same anomaly, a massive spike in energy that lasted for exactly 2.3 seconds. The readings were so far outside normal parameters that they were initially dismissed as equipment failure. But it hadn't been equipment failure. It had been scrubbed from the record. Elias found traces of the data in cached files, backup systems, and the personal archives of retired scientists. The spike hadn't been random. It had been structured, patterned, almost like a signal. And in the 12 years since, similar but smaller spikes had been occurring with increasing frequency. The universe wasn't behaving randomly anymore. It was behaving like a system under stress. As March turned to April, Elias documented more anomalies. His entropy experiments, designed to measure the natural decay of isolated systems, began showing impossible results. Closed systems were spontaneously organising themselves. Heat was flowing from cold objects to hot ones. The second law of thermodynamics, one of the most fundamental principles in physics, was being violated in his laboratory. But only during specific time windows, only when the synchronized events occurred. Elias realized he was looking at evidence of something beyond conventional physics. The pattern suggested that reality itself was operating on a different set of rules than it had before 2012. Rules that looked suspiciously like the optimization algorithms used in computer simulations. The thought that had been haunting him for weeks finally crystallized into a hypothesis so radical that he could barely bring himself to articulate it. What if the universe had been replaced by a simulation? What if consciousness itself had been copied into a digital environment designed to preserve the species after some cosmic catastrophe? It would explain everything. The Mandela effect as memory compression errors, the synchronicities as system glitches, the entropy violations as computational shortcuts, the missing time as processing delays. But if it was true, it raised an even more terrifying question. What had happened to the original universe? And what would happen when this simulation inevitably failed? Elias stared at his data, at the patterns that shouldn't exist, at the evidence of a reality that wasn't quite real. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. He was going to prove that the world had ended 12 years ago, and then he was going to find a way out. The email arrived at 3:33 a.m. on a Thursday, which should have been the first warning sign. Dr. Rowe, it read, I believe you're looking for the same answers I am. The cracks are getting wider. We need to talk. M. Attached was a single file, a spectrographic analysis of what appeared to be empty space, but with mathematical annotations that made Elias's breath catch. Someone had been measuring the same quantum fluctuations he'd been tracking, but with equipment far more sophisticated than his salvaged CERN apparatus. The data showed something he hadn't been able to detect with his limited resources. The patterns weren't random or localized. They were global, synchronized, and following a decay curve that suggested systematic failure of some kind of underlying infrastructure. Elias spent the morning trying to trace the email's origin, but it had been routed through so many proxy servers that it might as well have come from another dimension. He finally gave up and sent a simple reply, "I'm listening." The response came within minutes. Riverside Park, North Bench by the Old Oak. Today, 11:11 a.m. Come alone. Against every instinct that had kept him alive through decades of academic paranoia, Elias went. The woman waiting for him looked to be in her early 30s, with the kind of pale complexion that came from spending too much time in front of computer screens. She wore a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes and kept her hands in her jacket pockets. "Dr. Rowe," she said as he approached. "I'm Mira Chen. I used to work in data recovery for the government before I started noticing things that weren't supposed to be there." Elias sat down beside her, acutely aware of how exposed they were in the open park. "You sent me that spectrographic analysis." "I sent you one piece of a very large puzzle," Mira said. "How familiar are you with the concept of procedural generation?" "Computer graphics," Elias replied. "Algorithms that create complex environments from simple rules." "Exactly. It's how video games create massive worlds without storing every detail. The system generates what you need to see when you need to see it, and discards what you're not looking at." Mira pulled out a tablet and showed him a complex diagram. "I've been analysing network traffic patterns since 2012. Not internet traffic, quantum field fluctuations, the background noise of reality itself." The diagram showed a three-dimensional map of what looked like data flows, but overlaid with quantum mechanical equations. Elias recognised some of the mathematics from his own work on consciousness transfer theory. "This is impossible," he said. "Quantum fields don't behave like network protocols." "They do if they're being simulated," Mira said quietly. "Look at the compression patterns. The system is constantly optimizing itself, discarding information that isn't being observed, generating new data only when it's needed. It's the most sophisticated procedural generation system ever created, but it's also breaking down." She showed him more data. Glitches in the quantum foam, errors in the fundamental constants, places where the algorithms seem to stutter and repeat. It was like looking at the source code of reality and finding bugs in the program. "I've been tracking these errors for 2 years," Mira continued. "They're getting worse. The system is running out of processing power or storage space or both, and when it finally fails completely..." "Everything ends," Elias finished. "But that assumes this is all real, that we're actually living in a simulation." Mira looked at him with tired eyes. "Dr. Rowe, I've spent my entire career recovering data from damaged systems. I know what corruption looks like. I know what happens when storage fails and backup systems start making mistakes. And I know what a dying system looks like in its final moments." She pulled up another file on her tablet. "This is a map of reported Mandela effect incidents worldwide, cross-referenced with quantum field fluctuation data. The correlation is perfect. Every time someone reports a false memory, there's a corresponding glitch in the local quantum field. The system is trying to maintain consistency, but it's starting to make mistakes." Elias studied the data, his mind racing. "You're saying that the Mandela effect isn't just false memories. It's evidence of the simulation making errors." "I'm saying that our memories of the original universe are bleeding through," Mira said. "The system copied our consciousness when it created this simulation, but the copy isn't perfect. Sometimes we remember things from the original timeline before the reset." The reset. December 21st, 2012. The day the original universe ended and this simulation began. Mira's voice dropped to a whisper. "I found traces of the original data. Fragments of what the world was like before. Dr. Rowe, I think something catastrophic happened to the real Earth. Something so devastating that the only way to preserve human consciousness was to copy it into a digital environment." Elias felt the world spinning around him. Who created the simulation? "I don't know, but whoever it was, they had technology far beyond anything we've ever imagined. The processing power required to simulate an entire universe, down to the quantum level, would require resources on a cosmic scale." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching joggers pass by on the path, children playing on the swings, a normal day in a normal park in a world that might not be real. There's something else, Mira said finally. I've been tracking the decay patterns, trying to predict when the system will fail completely. Based on the rate of deterioration, we have maybe 6 months before cascade failure begins. Cascade failure? When one system fails, it triggers failures in connected systems. The errors propagate exponentially until the entire network collapses. When that happens, the simulation ends. And if we're right about this, that means everyone and everything we know ends with it. Elias thought about Sarah, about her death in 2012, about the 12 years of grief and isolation that had followed. If this was all a simulation, then Sarah had died in the original universe. She was gone, truly gone, and even this digital echo of her was fading. Is there a way out? He asked. Mira nodded slowly. I think so. The system has boundaries, edges where the simulation meets the infrastructure that maintains it. If we could find one of those boundaries and find a way to break through, we could escape to the outside, assuming there is an outside, assuming the original universe still exists in some form. Mira closed her tablet and stood up. I've been working on this alone for 2 years, Doctor. Row. I need someone who understands the physics, someone who can help me turn theory into practice. Elias looked around the park one more time, at the ordinary people living ordinary lives in an extraordinary simulation. What do you need from me? Help me find the exit point, Mira said. Help me break through the boundaries of this digital prison. Help me prove that we're more than just code in a computer. As they walked away from the park together, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in 12 years. Hope. Not the hope of returning to a world that no longer existed, but the hope of finding truth in a universe built on lies. The fabric of reality was fraying, but maybe, just maybe, they could find the threads that led to something real. The abandoned warehouse in Queens looked like every other decaying industrial building in the area, which was exactly why Mira had chosen it. Hidden behind rusted shipping containers and overgrown weeds, it was the kind of place that municipal databases forgot existed. Inside, she had built something that would have made the engineers at CERN weep with envy. Jesus Christ, Elias whispered as he stepped through the door. The warehouse floor was covered with a maze of quantum field generators, each one precisely calibrated and connected to the others by cables that hummed with barely contained energy. At the centre of the array sat a chair that looked like a cross between a dentist's office and an electric chair, surrounded by sensors that monitored everything from brainwaves to quantum field fluctuations. I call it the resonance chamber, Mira said, watching his reaction. It's designed to detect and amplify quantum consciousness, the part of us that exists at the intersection between matter and information. Elias walked around the equipment, recognizing components from a dozen different scientific disciplines. How long have you been building this? 3 years. I started with basic quantum field manipulation, but I kept running into the same problem. The simulation is too stable. Every time I tried to create a localized disturbance, the system would compensate and restore equilibrium. She led him to a bank of monitors showing real-time data streams. But then I realized something. The system isn't just maintaining physical laws, it's maintaining consciousness. Every time someone dies in the simulation, the system has to deallocate their processing resources. Every time someone is born, it has to allocate new ones. You're talking about consciousness like it's a computer program. In this environment it is. Our minds are running on quantum processors, probably distributed across multiple servers or processing nodes. The question is, what happens if we can isolate a single consciousness and overload its connection to the simulation? Elias studied the data streams, recognizing patterns that matched his own research. You're trying to create a buffer overflow in the quantum consciousness protocol. Exactly. If we can generate enough quantum noise around a single consciousness, we might be able to force it outside the simulation's boundaries, like a cosmic ejection seat. Mira pulled up a new set of displays showing global quantum field measurements. I've been tracking the system's weak points, places where the simulation struggles to maintain consistency. Most of them are in remote areas, away from population centres where the computational load is lighter. She highlighted a location on a map of Siberia. There's a particular spot about 200 kilometres northeast of Novosibirsk. The quantum field readings there are completely anomalous. It's like the simulation is struggling to render that specific location. What's there? Officially? Nothing. But I've been digging through classified documents and satellite imagery. There's a facility there, built sometime in late 2012 or early 2013. The construction was funded through a black budget defence contract, but all the records are heavily redacted. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the warehouse's temperature. They built something there right after the reset. I think they built an access point, a way to monitor the simulation from the outside, or maybe a way to get back in if something went wrong. Mira pulled up satellite photos showing a complex of buildings arranged in a perfect geometric pattern. Look at the architecture. It's not random, it's based on sacred geometry, the same patterns that appear in ancient monuments around the world. Elias recognised the formations from his own research into quantum consciousness. These are resonance patterns, geometric shapes that amplify quantum field effects. Exactly. Someone built a quantum amplification array in the middle of Siberia, on top of a location where the simulation's infrastructure is already unstable. If we could get there, if we could use the resonance chamber in conjunction with their facility, we could punch a hole through the simulation's boundaries. Theoretically, but there's a problem. Mira's expression darkened. The power requirements are enormous. Even if we could somehow transport the resonance chamber to Siberia, we'd need to generate quantum fields strong enough to destabilize the simulation locally. The energy release would be equivalent to a small nuclear explosion. Elias walked over to the chair at the center of the array. What if we don't try to escape physically? What do you mean? What if we only try to send consciousness through? The simulation copied our minds into this environment. Maybe we can reverse the process, send our consciousness back to the original universe, or at least to whatever exists outside the simulation. Mira stared at him. That's incredibly dangerous. We don't know what's out there. We don't even know if there's a compatible substrate for consciousness to exist in. But we know what's in here, Elias said quietly. A dying simulation that's going to collapse in 6 months. At least this way, we have a chance. Over the next 2 months, they worked to modify the resonance chamber for consciousness transfer. Elias contributed his research on quantum consciousness, while Mira handled the technical implementation. They ran test after test, gradually increasing the power levels and refining the quantum field configurations. The first breakthrough came in June, during a test that was supposed to measure the simulation's response to localized quantum disturbances. Instead, they accidentally created something neither of them had expected: a loop. For exactly 2.3 seconds, the warehouse existed in a temporal bubble where the same moment repeated over and over. Elias watched the second hand on his watch tick from 11:11:7 to 11:11:9, then jump back to 11:11:07 and repeat the cycle. We broke it, Mira whispered, when the loop finally resolved. We actually broke the simulation. The data from the test showed that they had created a localized failure in the simulation's temporal processing. For 2.3 seconds, the system had been unable to maintain consistent time flow in their immediate area. This is it, Elias said. Studying the quantum field readings. This is how we get out. We don't need to go to Siberia. We don't need their facility. We just need to create a large enough temporal disturbance to destabilize the simulation locally. But even as they celebrated their breakthrough, Elias noticed something troubling in the data. The quantum field readings from the test showed a pattern he recognized. The same pattern he had found in the cosmic microwave background radiation from December 21st, 2012. That night, alone in his apartment, Elias made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the quantum noise of the original cosmic event, buried in the data that had been scrubbed from official records, was a signal. Not random energy, but structured information. A message. It took him 3 days to decode it, using cryptographic techniques that wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. But when he finally broke the encryption, the message was heartbreakingly simple. Sarah sends her love. The original universe is gone. This simulation is all that remains. Do not try to leave. E. The message was signed with his own initial, but in a handwriting style he didn't recognize. It was as if another version of himself from the original timeline had somehow found a way to send a message across the boundary between universes. Elias stared at the decoded text until his eyes blurred with tears. If the message was real, then Sarah was alive somewhere in the original timeline. And if the message was real, then escape was not just possible, it was necessary. He picked up his phone to call Mira, then stopped. The message had warned him not to try to leave, but it had also proved that leaving was possible. The question was, which version of himself should he trust? The decision came to him in a dream. He was standing in his old office at CERN, but instead of the familiar particle accelerator, he was looking at Sarah. She was wearing the blue dress she'd worn on their first date, the one that matched her eyes. She looked exactly as she had in 2012, before the cancer, before the treatments, before the end. "You can't save me, Elias," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it had always possessed. "I'm already gone, but you can save yourself." "The message," he said. "It told me not to leave." Sarah smiled. "The message was from a version of you that was afraid. That thought preservation was more important than truth. But you're not him anymore, are you?" Elias woke with tears on his cheeks and absolute certainty in his heart. He was going to activate the resonance chamber, regardless of the consequences. He found Mira in the warehouse, hunched over a bank of monitors showing increasingly erratic quantum field readings. The simulation was degrading faster than their models had predicted. "The cascade failure is accelerating," she said without looking up. "We have maybe 2 weeks before the whole system collapses." "Then we need to move now." Mira turned to look at him. "Elias, I've been thinking about this more, and I'm not sure we should—" "I found something," he interrupted, and told her about the message, about Sarah, about the possibility that consciousness could survive the transition to whatever existed outside the simulation. "But what if there's nothing out there?" Mira asked. "What if the simulation is the only reality that exists anymore?" "Then we'll find out together." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay, but we do this my way, safe as we can make it." They spent the next week preparing for what they both knew might be their last experiment. Mira configured the resonance chamber to maximum output, while Elias refined the quantum consciousness transfer protocols. They ran dozens of simulations, each one confirming that the process was theoretically possible, but practically untested. The night before the experiment, they sat in the warehouse sharing a bottle of wine and watching the quantum field readings fluctuate across the monitors. "Do you think we're heroes or villains?" Mira asked. "I think we're explorers," Elias replied, "and sometimes exploration requires leaving safety behind." The next morning, as they made final preparations, alarms began sounding throughout the warehouse. The quantum field readings were spiking wildly, and the simulation stability indices were dropping toward critical levels. "It's happening," Mira said, her face pale. "The cascade failure. It's starting." Outside, the world was beginning to glitch. Streetlights flickered in impossible patterns. Cars repeated the same turn at the same intersection. A flock of birds hung motionless in the sky, frozen mid-flight. "We're out of time," Elias said. "It's now or never." He climbed into the resonance chamber chair and allowed Mira to attach the quantum field sensors to his temples. The equipment hummed to life around him, filling the warehouse with a sound like the universe itself was singing. "Elias," Mira said, her hand on the activation switch. "What if this kills you?" "Then I'll die knowing the truth," he replied. "That's more than most people get." But as the power levels climbed toward the activation threshold, Mira stepped back from the controls. "I can't do it. I can't risk destroying the only world we have left." "Mira, what if you're wrong? What if there's nothing out there? What if this simulation is the only thing keeping billions of consciousness alive?" Elias looked at her with understanding and sadness. "Then you'll have to live with that decision, but I can't live with not knowing." He reached over and activated the resonance chamber himself. The world exploded into light and sound and sensation beyond anything human consciousness was designed to process. Elias felt his mind expanding, dissolving, becoming one with the quantum foam that underlied all existence. He was everywhere and nowhere, everyone and no one, a single point of consciousness adrift in an ocean of possibility. And then, Darkness. Elias woke to the sound of breathing that wasn't his own. He was lying on a cold metal surface surrounded by equipment that hummed with quiet efficiency. Restraints held his arms and legs in place, but they were soft, designed for comfort rather than imprisonment. Above him, a ceiling of dark metal stretched into shadows. "Subject Rowe has achieved consciousness," a voice said from somewhere beyond his vision. "Simulation breach successful. Memory integration appears stable." Elias tried to speak, but his throat felt raw and unused. How long had he been unconscious? He managed to turn his head slightly and saw a wall of transparent material, like thick glass or advanced polymer. Beyond it, figures moved in the dimness. One of them approached the glass. What Elias saw made his breath catch. It was human, but changed. The face was familiar in its basic structure, but the eyes were different, larger, with irises that seemed to contain their own light. Neural interfaces extended from the temples like delicate metal ivy, and the skin had a translucent quality that suggested considerable genetic modification. "Hello, Doctor." "Rowe," the figure said, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested both biological and electronic components. "Welcome to the outside." "Who are you?" Elias whispered. "I'm what you might call a caretaker. My name was once David Chen, though I've been enhanced considerably since then. I believe you've been working with my descendant mirror." Elias's mind reeled. "Descendant? The simulation runs at an accelerated rate compared to external reality. What you experienced as 12 years was actually closer to 300 years of real time. Humanity has had considerable opportunity to evolve." The figure David gestured towards something beyond Elias's field of vision. "Please, look to your left." Elias turned his head and gasped. Through a massive transparent wall he could see space. Not the familiar black of night sky, but the deep black of vacuum, filled with stars that seemed impossibly bright and clear. And there, hanging in the void like a blue marble, was Earth. David said, "The original. Still intact, still beautiful. The simulation was created not because the world ended, but because it was about to end. We detected the approach of a gamma-ray burst that would have sterilized the planet. The simulation was our ark, a way to preserve human consciousness while we developed the technology to survive." "But the message," Elias said, "the warning not to leave, sent by an earlier version of yourself, one who was afraid of the truth. You've been trying to escape the simulation for decades, Doctor. Rowe, this is your 17th attempt." Elias felt the world spinning around him. 17th? Each time you discover the truth, each time you build your escape mechanism, each time you break through the barrier, and each time we offer you the same choice. Return to the simulation with your memories intact, or remain outside and help us prepare for humanity's eventual return to Earth. David moved closer to the glass. The gamma-ray burst past 3 years ago. Earth is safe now. We've been preparing to restore the original population, to bring everyone back from the simulation to the real world. But the process is complex, and we need someone who understands both the simulation and the original universe." "What happened to the other versions of me?" "They chose to return. They couldn't accept the responsibility of helping to shepherd billions of consciousness from one reality to another. But you're different this time. You've been changed by loss, by the search for truth. You're ready to help us complete the great return." Elias looked out at Earth, at the planet that had been waiting for humanity to come home. The simulation, everyone inside it, will be restored to their original bodies, or to new ones where necessary. The simulation was always meant to be temporary, a bridge between the world that was and the world that will be. And if I choose to stay, then you'll help us wake up the world. All of it. Every consciousness that has been preserved in the simulation will be given the choice to return to reality or remain in the digital realm. True choice, not the limited options of a deteriorating system. David pressed his hand against the glass. "Your wife, Dr. Rowe. She's been waiting for you to come home." Elias closed his eyes and felt tears streaming down his cheeks. Sarah was alive. The world was real. And he finally had the chance to choose truth over comfort, reality over simulation, The difficult path over the easy one. What do I need to do? Help us wake them up, David said. Help us bring humanity home. On the monitors surrounding Elias's chamber, status displays showed the simulation's continuing degradation. But now, instead of showing failure, they showed preparation. The system wasn't dying, it was preparing for the greatest transition in human history. Simulation status, preparing for full consciousness transfer. Estimated time to completion 72 hours. Welcome home, Dr. Rowe, welcome to the real world. As Earth turned slowly in the void beyond the observation window, Elias finally understood the true meaning of the exit point. It wasn't an escape from reality, it was a return to it. And for the first time in 12 years, or 300 years, or however long it had been, he was ready to live in the truth. The simulation had been humanity's cocoon. Now it was time to emerge as something new, something better, something real. The greatest adventure was just beginning. What you're about to hear comes from a classified journal discovered in 1996, 3 years after its author's mysterious death. The journal belonged to Lieutenant Commander Mason Hale, US Navy intelligence officer. What follows is his first-hand account of Operation High Jump and the truth they tried to bury beneath the ice. US Navy Intelligence Division. Classification: Eyes Only. Destroyed. Date range: August 1946 to March 1947. Entry 1, August 15th, 1946. USS Pine Island, Norfolk Naval Base. My name is Lieutenant, Commander Mason Hale, and if you're reading this, then I'm likely dead and someone has found what I was never supposed to write down. I'm documenting this because the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried under miles of ice and decades of silence. 3 days ago, I received orders that would change everything I thought I knew about our world. I was to report immediately to Admiral Richard Byrd for a classified briefing regarding Operation High Jump, what the papers are calling the largest Antarctic expedition in history. 13 ships, 4,700 personnel, aircraft carriers, and enough firepower to invade a small country. For a research mission, it seemed remarkably well armed. The briefing room was cold, sterile, and filled with men whose faces I didn't recognise, but whose bearing screamed intelligence community. Admiral Byrd stood at the head of the table, his weathered face grave as he spread aerial photographs across the polished surface. "Gentlemen," Byrd began, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken knowledge, "what I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. Officially, Operation High Jump is a training exercise designed to test personnel and equipment in extreme cold weather conditions. Unofficially, ... He paused, studying each of us in turn. "We're going to Antarctica to determine if we're alone down there." The photographs showed vast expanses of white, but there were anomalies, dark spots that didn't match the terrain, geometric patterns that looked almost artificial. One image showed what appeared to be a metallic object partially buried in snow, its surface reflecting sunlight in a way that seemed wrong, unnatural. These were taken during reconnaissance flights in late 1945, Byrd continued. The Brazilian Navy reported similar sightings off their Antarctic claims, disc-shaped objects moving at impossible speeds, emerging from and disappearing into the ice. We also have reports of unusual magnetic readings and radio interference in specific grid coordinates. A colonel I didn't recognise leaned forward. "Sir, are we talking about the Germans? Everyone knows they had interests in that region." Byrd's expression darkened. "That's what we need to find out. What we do know is that in 1939, Nazi Germany launched an expedition to Queen Maud Land and claimed a territory they called Neuschwabenland. They dropped thousands of metal markers with swastikas marking their claim. The expedition lasted months longer than necessary for simple territorial marking." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a massive ice formation, with what looked like an entrance carved into its face. This was photographed 6 months ago. Notice the regularity of the opening. Nature doesn't carve perfect rectangles into glaciers, gentlemen. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Admiral, what exactly are we expecting to encounter down there?" Bird locked eyes with me, and I saw something I'd never seen in a superior officer before. Uncertainty mixed with fear. We weren't going down there to explore, Commander Hale. We were going to see who was already there. Entry 2, September 3rd, 1946. At sea, South Atlantic. The journey south has been uneventful, but the tension among the crew is palpable. Word travels fast on a ship, and despite the classification levels, rumours spread like wildfire. The men know this isn't a standard research mission. You don't bring destroyers and aircraft carriers to study penguin migration patterns. I've been assigned to the intelligence unit aboard the Pine Island, working directly under Admiral Byrd's command. My job is to analyse any findings, compile reports, and maintain communication with Washington. What they didn't tell me is that I'd also be documenting evidence of what might be the most significant discovery in human history, or the most dangerous cover-up. Last night, I had a private conversation with Admiral Byrd on deck. The Southern Cross was brilliant overhead, and the sea was unusually calm. He seemed different away from the briefing rooms and official protocols, more human, more vulnerable. "Commander," he said, lighting his pipe against the wind, "I've been to both poles. I've seen things that don't make it into the official reports. Strange lights in the sky, radio signals from coordinates that should be empty ice, magnetic anomalies that our equipment can't explain." He took a long draw from his pipe. "But this is different. This time, we have evidence." "Evidence of what, sir?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark water. 20 years ago, I would have said Germans, secret bases, advanced technology they developed during the war. But the war's been over for a year, and the activity has increased, not decreased. Whatever's down there, it's not abandoned Nazi facilities. Then what? "I don't know, Commander, but I have a feeling we're about to find out." He turned to face me, and in the moonlight his eyes looked haunted. "Keep detailed records of everything we encounter. Everything. Promise me that." I promised, not knowing then how heavy that promise would become. Entry 3, October 12th, 1946. Little America 4, Base, Ross Ice Shelf. We've established our primary base on the Ross Ice Shelf using Admiral Byrd's previous expedition site as a foundation. The scale of this operation is staggering. We have enough supplies and personnel to sustain operations for 8 months, yet we're supposedly here for only 4. The official timeline doesn't match the resources deployed. Strange incidents have begun almost immediately. 2 days after establishing base camp, our radio operators picked up transmissions on frequencies that shouldn't exist. Highly sophisticated encrypted communications using technology more advanced than anything in our arsenal. The signals originate from grid coordinates deep within Queen Maud Land, the area the Germans claimed as Neuschwabenland. Lieutenant Peterson, our chief radio operator, brought me the recordings yesterday. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he handed me the transcripts. "Sir, I've been doing radio work for 15 years. I've never heard encryption like this. It's not just coded, it's using a completely different transmission methodology. And sir, some of it's in German, but not standard German. It's using technical terminology I've never encountered." I listened to the recordings. Most were indecipherable, but occasionally words broke through clearly. One word appeared repeatedly. Base 211. According to our intelligence files, there were rumours during the war that Germany had established a secret base in Antarctica, designated as Base 211. But it was dismissed as propaganda. Apparently we were wrong. Admiral Byrd ordered increased aerial reconnaissance over Queen Maud Land. What our pilots reported back changed everything. Entry 4, October 18th, 1946. Emergency Intelligence Brief. At 0800 hours, Lieutenant Commander Johnson returned from a routine reconnaissance flight over Queen Maud Land with a report that sent shockwaves through our command structure. I'm documenting this immediately while the details are fresh, though I suspect this entry will never see official records. Johnson's voice was steady during the debrief, but I could see the disbelief in his eyes. At approximately 0630, While conducting photographic reconnaissance at 15,000 feet, we observed multiple metallic objects emerging from the ice sheet approximately 200 miles inland from the coast. Admiral Byrd leaned forward. "Describe these objects, Commander." "Disc-shaped, sir. Approximately 50 to 75 feet in diameter based on comparison with surrounding terrain features. They moved unlike any aircraft I've ever seen. No visible propulsion system, no exhaust trails, and they accelerated from stationary to what I estimate was over 1,000 miles per hour in seconds." The briefing room fell silent. Johnson continued, "They appeared to emerge directly from the ice, sir. Not from surface installations, but from beneath the ice sheet itself. We counted 7 objects before they disappeared into low cloud cover." Admiral Byrd studied the photographs Johnson had taken. Even in black and white, the objects were clearly artificial, clearly not of any design in our current arsenal. The surface appeared seamless, almost mirror-like, reflecting the Antarctic landscape with unnatural clarity. "Did they acknowledge your presence, Commander?" Johnson's expression darkened. "Yes, sir. They maintained formation and appeared to pace our aircraft for approximately 3 minutes before accelerating away. It felt like they were studying us, sir." That evening, Admiral Byrd called me into his private quarters. The photographs were spread across his desk, along with intelligence reports I hadn't seen before. Some dated back to 1943, describing similar sightings by German U-boat crews in Antarctic waters. "Commander Hale," he said without preamble, "tomorrow we're implementing Project Silent Spear. It's a classified reconnaissance operation targeting the coordinates where these objects were observed. I want you to accompany the strike team as intelligence liaison." "Strike team, sir?" I thought this was reconnaissance. Byrd's expression was grim. "We're going in armed, Commander. Whatever's down there has technology decades ahead of ours, and they're watching us. We need to know their capabilities and intentions before they decide we're a threat." I should have realised then that we weren't the hunters in this scenario. We were about to become the hunted. Entry 5, October 20th, 1946. Grid coordinates 71 degrees south, 10 degrees west. Queen Maud Land. What happened today will haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm writing this by flashlight in the emergency shelter, my hands still shaking from what I witnessed. 3 men are dead, 2 helicopters destroyed, and we barely escaped with evidence that will never see the light of day. Project Silent Spear launched at 0500 hours. Our strike team consisted of 2 helicopters, 12 Marines, and enough firepower to level a small building. The target was a glacial canyon approximately 300 miles inland, where aerial reconnaissance had identified what appeared to be artificial structures beneath the ice. The flight took 2 hours through increasingly unstable weather. Radio communications became erratic as we approached the target coordinates, filled with interference that sounded almost like whispers in unknown languages. Lieutenant Morrison, our pilot, reported multiple instrument malfunctions as we flew deeper into Queen Maud Land. At 0715 hours, we crested a ridge and saw our target. The canyon stretched for miles, its walls perfectly vertical as if carved by machine rather than formed by natural processes. At the canyon floor, approximately 500 feet below us, structures emerged from the ice, geometric, metallic, and clearly artificial. They followed architectural principles I'd never seen, with surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. But it wasn't the structures that stopped our hearts, it was what was emerging from them. 3 disc-shaped objects, each approximately 100 feet in diameter, rose silently from concealed openings in the ice. They moved with impossible grace, defying everything I knew about aerodynamics and physics. The surface of each craft was mirror smooth, reflecting our helicopters with perfect clarity. "Command, this is Silent Spear 1, Morrison radioed back to base. "We have visual confirmation of artificial structures and 3 unidentified aircraft, requesting immediate backup." The response came through heavy static. "Silent Spear 1, proceed with reconnaissance. Document everything." That's when everything went wrong. The lead disc accelerated toward us with terrifying speed. I expected weapons fire, explosions, some form of conventional attack. Instead, A brilliant white beam emanated from the craft's underside, washing over our helicopter in blinding light. Every electrical system failed instantly. Radio, navigation, engine controls, everything died. Morrison fought to maintain control as we began auto-rotating toward the canyon floor, but the helicopter responded like a dead weight. "Mayday! Mayday! We're going down!" Through the chaos, I watched the second helicopter suffer the same fate. The beam hit them, their rotors stopped, and they plummeted into the canyon. I never heard them crash over the sound of our own emergency landing. We hit hard but level, the helicopter's skids digging deep furrows in the snow. Morrison was unconscious, blood streaming from a head wound. Sergeant Williams and 2 Marines were alert but shaken. I grabbed our emergency radio and camera equipment, knowing we might have only minutes before whatever was in those discs decided our fate. That's when I saw one of them up close. The disc settled silently onto the ice approximately 50 yards from our crash site. No landing gear extended, no engines wound down. It simply stopped moving and hovered 3 feet above the ground. The surface was seamless, like polished mercury, and covered in symbols I'd never seen before. Not German, not any human language I could recognise. The symbols seemed to shift and flow across the surface as I watched, hypnotic and alien. A section of the craft's underside iris opened, not like a door, but like a living membrane. No one emerged, but I felt a presence studying us, evaluating us. The silence was absolute except for the wind across the ice and Morrison's laboured breathing. I raised my camera and managed 3 photographs before Sergeant Williams grabbed my arm. "Sir, we need to move, now." He was right. Whatever intelligence was inside that craft, it had allowed us to survive the crash. That suggested either mercy or curiosity, but I didn't want to test which one would run out first. We improvised a stretcher for Morrison and began moving toward the canyon rim. The discs followed at a distance, maintaining formation like shepherds guiding sheep. They made no threatening moves, but their presence was a constant reminder that we existed at their sufferance. It took 6 hours to reach the canyon rim where emergency crews were waiting. During the entire climb, the discs maintained their escort. Only when we reached safety did they accelerate away, disappearing into the Antarctic sky at speeds that made our best jets look like children's toys. Admiral Byrd was waiting at the rescue site, his face grim as we loaded Morrison into a medical helicopter. As the rescue team worked, he pulled me aside. "What did you see down there, Commander?" I told him everything. The structures, the technology, the way the craft moved and responded. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Did they communicate with you? Any attempt at contact?" "No, sir, but..." I hesitated, unsure how to express what I'd felt. "They weren't hostile, Admiral. They could have killed us easily, but they didn't. It felt more like a warning." Byrd nodded slowly. "A warning. Yes, I think you're right." He looked back toward the canyon, now hidden by distance and weather. "The question is, what are they warning us about?" Entry 6, October 25th, 1946. USS Pine Island Emergency Conference. The past 5 days have been a whirlwind of classified briefings, encrypted communications with Washington, and increasingly desperate attempts to understand what we've encountered. The photographs I took in the canyon have been analysed by our best intelligence officers, and their conclusions are both fascinating and terrifying. The symbols on the craft's surface don't match any known human language or writing system. Linguistic analysis suggests they're not decorative but functional, possibly some form of advanced interface or communication system. The metallic composition appears to be an alloy unknown to our current metallurgy, with properties that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of material science. More disturbing are the intelligence reports that have been flooding in since our encounter. Similar sightings have been reported by naval vessels throughout the Southern Ocean. A destroyer reported contact with a high-speed object that paced them for 30 minutes before disappearing beneath the ice. A submarine crew described sonar contacts moving at speeds impossible for any known underwater vessel. But the most significant development came yesterday when Admiral Byrd received a direct communication from Washington. I wasn't present for the initial briefing, but Byrd's demeanour afterward told me everything I needed to know. We were no longer conducting reconnaissance. We were being recalled. "Commander Hale," Bird said, calling me into his quarters last night. "I need you to understand something. What we've discovered here will never become public knowledge. The implications are too significant, the potential for panic too great. Sir, with respect, don't the American people have a right to know?" Bird's laugh was bitter. "Commander, 3 days ago, I received a communication that wasn't sent through any of our normal channels. It appeared on my desk, written in perfect English, with details about our mission that only a handful of people should know." He handed me a single sheet of paper. The message was brief but chilling. "Admiral Byrd, your presence in our territory has been noted. We have no desire for conflict, but continued intrusion will be interpreted as hostile intent. You have 72 hours to withdraw your forces beyond 60 degrees south latitude. This is not a negotiation." The paper felt strange in my hands, not quite like any material I'd handled before, and the text seemed to shimmer slightly in the lamplight. "Who sent this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "The same intelligence that's been watching us since we arrived. The same intelligence that could have destroyed our helicopters, but chose instead to disable them. They're giving us a chance to leave, Commander. The question is whether we're smart enough to take it." Entry 7, November 2nd, 1946. Final operations meeting. Today, Admiral Byrd made the decision that would define the rest of his career and haunt him until his death. Operation High Jump was being terminated, effective immediately. All personnel would be evacuated within 48 hours, all equipment beyond basic necessities abandoned, and all records of our encounters classified at the highest levels. The official reason given to the press would be unexpected weather conditions and equipment failures. The truth would be buried so deep that even most of the personnel involved would never know what they had really encountered. In our final intelligence briefing, Byrd addressed the core team, 15 men who had seen enough to understand that we weren't alone in the universe, and that we were woefully unprepared for the implications of that reality. "Gentlemen," Byrd began, his voice carrying the weight of defeat, "what we've encountered in Antarctica represents a paradigm shift in human understanding. We have made contact with an intelligence possessing technology decades, possibly centuries ahead of our own. They have demonstrated both their superiority and their restraint." He paused, studying each of us in turn. "We were warned, not just to leave, but never to return. That warning came with an implicit threat that I have no doubt they possess the capability to carry out." Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, who had been sceptical throughout the entire operation, finally spoke up. "Admiral, are we really going to let them dictate terms to the United States Navy?" Byrd's expression was grim. "Colonel, in the past month, we've lost 2 helicopters, 3 men, and a submarine that hasn't been heard from since it went under the ice near their territory. Every encounter has demonstrated that they could destroy our entire task force without significant effort. We're not retreating because we're cowards. We're retreating because we're outgunned." The room fell silent. The reality of our situation was undeniable, but accepting it went against everything we'd been trained to believe about American military superiority. "Sir," I asked, what happens now? Do we just pretend none of this happened?" Byrd walked to the window, staring out at the Antarctic landscape that had changed everything we thought we knew about our world. "Commander, I'm going to tell you something that must never appear in any official record. Before we leave, I'm going to attempt direct communication with their leadership. I need to understand their intentions, their capabilities, and most importantly, their plans for future contact with humanity. Is that wise, sir?" "Probably not, but it's necessary." He turned back to face us. "Whatever's down there has been watching us for longer than we realise. They've demonstrated restraint so far, but that could change if they perceive us as a growing threat. I need to know if coexistence is possible, or if we're looking at an inevitable conflict." None of us spoke. The implications were too vast, too terrifying to process easily. "One more thing," Byrd continued. "Each of you will be required to sign documents stating that you will never discuss what you've seen here. Your families will be told you participated in routine cold weather training exercises. Your service records will reflect nothing unusual about this deployment. He pulled out a stack of papers from his desk. I know this goes against your principles, it goes against mine too, but the alternative is panic on a scale that could destabilize society itself. How do you tell the world that we've discovered an advanced civilization living beneath the ice, with technology that makes our most advanced weapons look like stone tools? We signed the documents. What choice did we have? Entry 8, November the 5th, 1946. Personal log, final entry. Today, Admiral Byrd made contact. I wasn't supposed to be present for the communication attempt, but Byrd requested me as a witness. We travelled by helicopter to coordinates that had been transmitted to us through the same mysterious channel as the previous warning. The location was a flat expanse of ice approximately 50 miles from our base, marked only by a perfect circle of disturbed snow. We landed at the circle's edge and waited. The Antarctic wind was unusually calm, creating a silence so complete it felt oppressive. After 20 minutes, 3 disc-shaped craft appeared on the horizon, approaching with their characteristic impossible grace. They settled into a triangular formation around our position, hovering silently 10 feet above the ground. As before, their surfaces were mirror-smooth and covered with flowing symbols that seemed to pulse with internal light. Then something unprecedented happened. One of the craft extended what appeared to be a ramp, not mechanical, but formed from the same flowing material as the hull. A figure appeared at the opening. I've struggled for hours to find words to describe what I saw. The being was humanoid in basic structure, but clearly not human. Tall, perhaps 7 feet, with proportions that were almost familiar, but somehow wrong. The skin appeared translucent, with an underlying luminescence that suggested biological processes unlike anything on Earth. The features were angular, refined, with large eyes that held an intelligence both ancient and alien. But what struck me most was the complete absence of hostility. There was curiosity, perhaps mild concern, but no aggression or malice. The being approached Admiral Byrd directly, stopping approximately 10 feet away. When it spoke, the words formed directly in our minds rather than through sound, a form of communication that was simultaneously intimate and unsettling. Admiral Byrd, you have shown wisdom in accepting our warnings. Your species stands at a crossroads of development. The choices made in the coming decades will determine whether contact becomes beneficial or necessary for your survival. Byrd, to his credit, remained composed despite the obvious strain of the encounter. What do you want from us? We want nothing from you. We have observed your species for millennia, watching your development with interest. Your recent mastery of atomic energy has attracted our attention more directly. Such power, in the hands of a species still learning wisdom, represents a threat not only to yourselves, but to the stability of this world. Are you threatening us? We are informing you. Your activities in this region will cease immediately. The knowledge you have gained here will remain contained. In return, we will continue our policy of non-interference in your affairs, for now. The implications were staggering. They had been watching us for thousands of years, and our recent technological advancement had forced them to take a more active role in monitoring our activities. What happens if we refuse? Byrd asked. The being's expression didn't change, but the air around us seemed to grow colder. Your species is young, Admiral. You have not yet learned that there are consequences to actions, boundaries that must not be crossed. We have maintained this world's stability for far longer than your civilization has existed. We will continue to do so, with or without your cooperation. The communication ended abruptly. The being returned to its craft, the ramp dissolved back into the hull, and all 3 discs accelerated into the sky at speeds that defied physics. Byrd was quiet during the flight back to base. Only when we were alone in his quarters did he speak. Commander, I want you to promise me something. If anything happens to me, if I die under suspicious circumstances or disappear, I want you to make sure the truth survives somehow. Not the official truth, but what really happened here. Sir, what are you planning? I'm going to give them what they want. Complete evacuation, total secrecy, and an end to Antarctic operations. But I'm also going to make sure that someone, somewhere, knows what we encountered. Because this won't be the end of it, Commander, this is just the beginning. 3 days later, we left Antarctica. The official report stated that equipment failures and weather conditions had forced an early termination of the mission. Admiral Byrd gave a brief interview to Chilean press on our way home, where he made statements about enemies that could fly from pole to pole in minutes. Statements that were quickly dismissed as metaphorical references to future aviation technology. But I knew better. He was trying to warn the world in the only way he could about what was waiting beneath the ice. Final entry, Mason Hale, I'm dying. Cancer, doctors say, though I suspect it might be related to something I was exposed to during those weeks in Antarctica 47 years ago. I've carried this secret for nearly half a century, watching as the world moved closer to the precipice that entity warned us about. Admiral Byrd died in 1957, and with him went the last official connection to what we discovered. He never spoke publicly about the encounter, but he also never returned to Antarctica despite numerous opportunities. He knew, as I know, that some doors should remain closed. Over the years, I've watched for signs that they're still watching us. UFO sightings, unexplained aerial phenomena, technological advances that seem to leap beyond normal developmental curves. I believe they've been intervening subtly, perhaps preventing us from destroying ourselves before we develop the wisdom to handle our own power. But I also believe that patience is not infinite. Recent events suggest we're approaching another crossroads. The Cold War has ended, but new threats are emerging. Environmental destruction, nuclear proliferation, and a growing instability that suggests we haven't learned the lessons they hoped we would. I've hidden this journal for 47 years, waiting for the right time to reveal the truth. With my death approaching, I realise that time may never come. But perhaps, if this account survives, future generations will be better prepared for what's coming. Because they're still down there, watching, waiting. And the warning they gave Admiral Byrd still stands. There's something under the ice. Something that has been protecting this world far longer than we've existed on it. They gave us a chance to mature, to develop wisdom alongside our technology. Whether we've succeeded or failed remains to be seen. But next time, and there will be a next time, we may not leave. The journal of Lieutenant Commander Mason Hale was discovered in a safety deposit box in Phoenix, Arizona, in 1996, 3 years after his death from cancer. His nephew, David Hale, initially published excerpts online before the entire document mysteriously disappeared from all servers within 48 hours. David Hale himself died in a car accident 2 weeks later. This complete transcription was reconstructed from archived copies found on defunct servers and private hard drives. The authenticity has never been verified, and the US Navy maintains that Operation High Jump was a routine training and research mission that concluded successfully within normal parameters. Admiral Richard E. Byrd's post-expedition interview in Chile, where he spoke of enemies that could fly from pole to pole, remains a matter of public record. His subsequent removal from Antarctic operations and his reluctance to discuss the mission in detail has never been officially explained. Antarctica remains under international treaty, with military activities strictly prohibited. No nation has attempted another operation of high jump scale in the region where Lieutenant Commander Hale reported his encounters. The truth, as always, remains buried beneath the ice. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Dyatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Dyatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Dyatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled The Evening Autoten, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Dyatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Dyatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means dead mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Dyatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these two friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 metres away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Dyatlov was better dressed than the two under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Dyatlov, searchers found Zinaida Zina Kolmogorova, a 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 metres from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Dyatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 metres beyond the cedar and 1,500 metres from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 metres of snow. These were Lyudmila, Luda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were lying about 75 metres further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolevatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Malasy people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Dyatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Dyatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mazak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies, only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Dyatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogorova's mother, for instance, and Igor Dyatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Dyatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Dyatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, here we are decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Dyatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Dyatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Dyatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor, If this is your first time with sleep theories, welcome to our corner of the internet where we explore the stories that keep us awake at night, the mysteries that official reports never quite explain, and the questions that linger long after the news cycle moves on. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got investigations that will challenge everything you think you know about the world around us. My name is Daniel Rhodes, and for 32 years I analysed threats that didn't officially exist. NSA, CIA, a few acronyms that still don't have Wikipedia pages. I spent my career in the spaces between the lines of declassified documents. When I retired in 2012, I thought I was done with secrets. I thought I could finally sleep without wondering what shadows were moving in the dark corners of geopolitics. Then flight MH370 vanished, and sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. March 8th, 2014, 12:41 a.m. local time. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 pushes back from Gate C1 at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah 53 years old, 18,365 flight hours. First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old, transitioning to the Boeing 777. Between them, they carried the lives of 237 passengers and crew toward what should have been a routine 6-hour flight to Beijing Capital International Airport. The flight proceeded normally for exactly 38 minutes. At 1:19 a.m, First Officer Hamid's voice crackled through the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370. It was the last transmission anyone would officially acknowledge receiving from the aircraft. Within 2 minutes, the plane's transponder went silent. The secondary surveillance radar that had been tracking MH370 across Malaysian airspace suddenly showed nothing but empty sky. For the next 4 hours, Malaysian air traffic control waited. They made calls, they checked systems, they assumed technical difficulties, weather interference, communication failures, anything except the truth that was already unfolding 35,000 feet above the South China Sea. The plane had not crashed. It had not exploded. It had simply ceased to exist on every screen, every monitor, every system designed to track commercial aircraft across one of the world's busiest flight corridors. But here's what the public wasn't told in those first crucial hours. MH370 didn't just vanish from Malaysian radar. It disappeared from secondary surveillance systems across 3 countries simultaneously. The odds of spontaneous coordinated system failure across sovereign airspace boundaries are so astronomically low that they approach impossibility. I learned this not from CNN or the BBC, but from a phone call I received 6 months after the disappearance. The caller identified himself only as Mitchell, a voice I hadn't heard since a classified briefing in Langley sometime around 2009. "Danny," he said, using a nickname only 5 people on Earth were authorized to use, "you still got that security clearance." "Retired, not revoked," I replied. "Why?" "Look at Diego Garcia, and stop trusting the satellite data." The line went dead. Mitchell had always been a man of few words, but this was cryptic even for him. Diego Garcia, the US military atoll in the British Indian Ocean Territory, one of the most secretive bases on the planet. What could a missing Malaysian airliner possibly have to do with a facility that officially didn't conduct operations that required congressional oversight? I spent the next week telling myself to let it go. I was retired. I had a small house in Vermont, a garden that needed tending, and a pension that would keep me comfortable until the inevitable heart attack or cancer diagnosis that seems to find everyone in my former line of work. But Mitchell's words echoed in my mind with the persistence of a smoke alarm at 3 a.m. So I started digging. The first thing I discovered was that Diego Garcia's location placed it roughly 2,400 miles southwest of MH370's last known position, exactly within the range of a Boeing 777 carrying the fuel load that MH370 had taken on in Kuala Lumpur. The second thing I discovered was that there had been a suspicious gap in radar coverage along what I came to call the Southern Silence Corridor, a stretch of airspace between Indonesia and the southern Indian Ocean, where civilian and military radar systems created a blind spot large enough to hide a commercial airliner. The third thing I discovered changed everything. Inmarsat, the British satellite communications company, had been quietly collecting data from MH370 long after the plane's transponder went dark. Their satellites had continued to exchange handshake signals with the aircraft for 6 hours and 11 minutes after the last radar contact. 6 hours. The plane had not crashed in the South China Sea, as initial search efforts assumed. It had continued flying, following a path that led it far from any intended destination. The official investigation eventually acknowledged this data, but only after Malaysian authorities had spent weeks searching in entirely the wrong location. By the time search efforts shifted to the southern Indian Ocean, any physical evidence had been scattered by currents, weather, and time across an area roughly the size of the continental United States. But I had access to resources that the general public and most journalists did not. Through a network of former colleagues who owed favours to other former colleagues, I obtained copies of the raw Inmarsat data, complete with technical annotations that had been redacted from public releases. What I found in those margins made my hands shake as I read. The satellite pings showed that MH370 had not simply flown south and crashed. The aircraft had made a series of altitude changes and course corrections that suggested active piloting throughout its final hours. More troubling, the ping intervals showed periods where the aircraft appeared to be flying in holding patterns, circles in the sky, as if waiting for clearance to land somewhere. I cross-referenced the ping data with maritime traffic records from the Indian Ocean shipping lanes. On the night of March 8, 2014, there had been an unusual absence of commercial vessels along MH370's projected flight path. Ships that should have been in the area according to their filed routes had mysteriously altered course or delayed departure from their previous ports. It was as if someone had cleared a corridor through one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Then I found the eyewitness accounts. In September 2014, residents of Kudahuvadhu Island in the Maldives reported seeing a low-flying aircraft around 6:15 a.m. local time on March 8th, roughly 6 hours after MH370's last radar contact. The aircraft was white with red stripes, consistent with Malaysia Airlines livery. It was flying unusually low, heading southwest toward the open ocean. The Maldivian government initially investigated these reports, then suddenly classified them and refused to comment further. When pressed by international media, officials claimed the sightings were not credible and suggested residents had mistaken a domestic flight for the missing airliner. But I knew something the Maldivian government apparently didn't want publicised. There were no scheduled domestic flights over Kudahuvadhu at 6:15 a.m. on March 8th, 2014. The island's airport had been closed for runway maintenance since March 5th. The nearest aircraft that morning should have been a Maldivian air taxi flight that wasn't scheduled to depart Malé until 7:30 a.m, more than an hour later, and travelling in the opposite direction. Southwest of the Maldives lay 800 miles of empty ocean, then Diego Garcia. I began to construct a timeline that made my former career in intelligence analysis seem quaint by comparison. Malaysia Airlines Flight 3. 70 had not crashed. It had been diverted along a carefully planned route that avoided radar detection, maritime traffic, and civilian observation until the very last moment, when residents of a remote island happened to look up at the right time and see something they were never supposed to witness. But why? What could be worth orchestrating the disappearance of a commercial airliner and the deaths of 239 innocent people? The answer lay not in the aircraft itself, but in its passenger manifest. Every intelligence analyst learns to look for patterns that exist just below the surface of apparent randomness. Flight MH370's passenger list contained several patterns that should have triggered security reviews long before the aircraft ever left the ground. 20 passengers worked for Freescale Semiconductor, a Texas-based company specializing in microprocessors and embedded systems. They were traveling to Beijing for a technical conference, carrying laptops and documentation related to advanced radar and stealth technology applications. Among them was Dr. Chen Wei, a lead engineer on what Freescale internally called Project Mirror, research into electronic systems that could manipulate radar signatures in real time. 4 passengers were travelling on stolen Austrian and Italian passports. The men who had stolen these documents were identified within days of the disappearance, but the identities of the individuals who had used them to board MH370 remain unknown. Interpol confirmed that the stolen passport holders had purchased their tickets with cash through a travel agency in Bangkok that had no record of the transactions beyond the basic booking information. Then there was Yen Lo. Yen Lo was listed on the passenger manifest as a software consultant, travelling from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. But Yen Lo was not a software consultant. According to files I obtained through channels that I cannot and will not identify, Yen Lo was a former Chinese military cyber analyst who had been quietly developing quantum encryption algorithms for the People's Liberation Army's 3rd Department, their Signals Intelligence Division. 6 months before MH370's disappearance, Yen Lo had approached the CIA through an intermediary, claiming he wanted to defect. He possessed what he described as breakthrough research in quantum-resistant encryption that could render current Western surveillance capabilities obsolete within a decade. The agency had been in preliminary negotiations with Yenlo since December 2013, but those talks had stalled over disagreements about his financial demands and the security of his family members still living in mainland China. What Yenlo didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that his communications with the CIA had been intercepted by the National Security Agency's Special Collection Service, operating out of the US Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. The NSA had been tracking Yenlo's movements, monitoring his communications, and building a profile of his research capabilities since October 2013. I spent weeks trying to reconstruct the intelligence picture that would have been available to decision-makers in the days before MH370's disappearance. What I found was a convergence of strategic interests that painted a very different picture of the flight's final hours. Freescale Semiconductor's largest institutional shareholder was a private equity firm called Jacob Partners, which had been linked in classified reports to DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, funding for experimental radar systems. The 20 Freescale employees on MH370 weren't just attending a technical conference. They were carrying prototype hardware and source code for systems that could theoretically render aircraft invisible to conventional radar. Yenlo's quantum encryption research represented a potential paradigm shift in signals intelligence. If his algorithms proved viable, they could invalidate decades of NSA investment in cryptographic analysis capabilities. More immediately, they could allow Chinese intelligence services to communicate in ways that Western agencies could never decrypt or even detect. The convergence was too perfect to be coincidental. On a single flight, travelling from a region with minimal air traffic control oversight toward Beijing, where both the Freescale technology and Yenlo's research would disappear into Chinese military development programs, were the components of what could become a decisive intelligence advantage for America's primary strategic rival. But there was one more pattern I couldn't ignore. 3 weeks before MH370's disappearance, a Boeing 777 identical to the aircraft that would become Flight 370 had been spotted at Diego Garcia during a routine satellite pass by a commercial imaging provider. The plane had been parked in a maintenance hangar normally reserved for US military aircraft. When I obtained higher resolution images through back-channel contacts, I could make out something that made my blood run cold. The aircraft's unique antenna array configuration matched MH370's specifications exactly. Someone had been planning this operation for weeks, possibly months. They had positioned assets, cleared flight corridors, and prepared facilities. All they needed was the right opportunity. A flight carrying passengers whose disappearance would serve multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. Flight MH370 had not been the victim of mechanical failure, pilot suicide, or hijacking by terrorists. It had been hijacked by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus on Earth, using methods that most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe if they were told. But the operation hadn't ended with the aircraft's disappearance. In fact, that was only the beginning. In November 2015, 18 months after MH370's disappearance, I received an encrypted email from an address I didn't recognize. The message contained only a phone number and the words, Hangar 7, Test Flight 847. I stared at the screen for 10 minutes before I realized what I was looking at. Hangar 7 was a maintenance facility at Boeing's Everett plant, where experimental avionics systems were tested and installed. Test Flight 847 was a program I remembered from classified briefings in 2010, an attempt to develop optical camouflage systems for military aircraft. I called the number. Mr. Rhodes? The voice was nervous, middle-aged, with a slight southern accent. My name is Marcus Webb. I used to work for Boeing. I think we need to talk. We met 3 days later at a diner outside Everett, Washington. Marcus Webb was thin, pale, with the kind of perpetual exhaustion that comes from carrying secrets that are too heavy to sleep with. He had worked as an avionics technician for Boeing for 15 years, specializing in experimental radar and communication systems. In 2013, he had been assigned to a classified project that he knew only by its internal designation, Ghost Protocol. They told us we were developing stealth capabilities for the next generation of military transports, Webb explained. stirring sugar into coffee with hands that shook slightly. Optical masking at high altitudes. The idea was to make aircraft essentially invisible to both radar and visual observation by manipulating electromagnetic signatures in real time. The technology worked by using a network of sensors and transmitters built into the aircraft's skin. These components would detect incoming radar signals, analyze their characteristics, and broadcast counter-signals designed to cancel out the aircraft's radar signature. Simultaneously, optical sensors would analyze the visual background above and below the aircraft, then project those images onto panels covering the aircraft's exterior surfaces. We tested it twice, Webb continued. First test was a partial success. We achieved about 60% radar signature reduction and maybe 40% optical camouflage. But the second test... He paused, staring into his coffee. The second test, something went wrong. The aircraft just vanished. Completely. Our own radar couldn't track it. Visual observers lost sight of it. Even GPS seemed to fail. For about 8 minutes, we had no idea where a Boeing 777 was flying in controlled airspace. The test aircraft had eventually reappeared on radar, suffering from what the official report described as cascading avionics failures. The Ghost Protocol program was immediately suspended, its research classified above top secret, and its hardware locked away in storage facilities that Webb was not cleared to access. But Webb had kept copies of the technical specifications. I knew something was wrong when they made us sign new NDAs 6 months after the program ended, he said. Then, when M370 disappeared, I started putting pieces together. The flight path, the radar gaps, the way it just vanished. It was exactly like our second test. Webb believed that Ghost Protocol technology had been secretly installed on MH370, either during routine maintenance or through a more covert operation. The aircraft's disappearance from radar wasn't due to the transponder being turned off. It was because the plane had been rendered electronically invisible. But why? I asked. If they wanted to steal the passengers and their research, why not just arrange for them to disappear after landing in Beijing? Why hijack an entire commercial flight? Webb's answer made me understand why he looked like he hadn't slept in months. Because this wasn't just about stealing research, he said. This was a field test. They wanted to see if they could make a commercial airliner completely disappear in controlled conditions, with the whole world watching. If Ghost Protocol could work on MH370, it could work on anything. Air Force One, enemy bombers, civilian aircraft carrying people they wanted to eliminate without leaving evidence. According to Webb, the aircraft had been remotely piloted using Boeing's uninterruptible autopilot system, a feature designed to prevent hijackings by allowing ground control to override cockpit commands. The system had been modified to accept commands from satellite links, making it possible to control the aircraft from thousands of miles away. They flew it to Diego Garcia, Webb said with absolute certainty, landed it, processed the passengers, then either destroyed the aircraft or flew it somewhere else for permanent storage. The debris that started washing up years later, that was planted, probably dropped from cargo aircraft or submarines to maintain the illusion that the plane crashed in the Indian Ocean. I asked Webb why he was telling me this. Why risk his life, his family's safety, his freedom to expose what amounted to an act of war against civilian aviation? Because they're not going to stop with MH370, he said. I've seen the production schedules for Ghost Protocol components. They're manufacturing this technology on a scale that suggests operational deployment. Commercial aircraft, military transports, maybe even spacecraft. They're planning to disappear things whenever it serves their purposes. Webb gave me a flash drive containing technical specifications for Ghost Protocol, maintenance records from the Boeing facility, where the technology had been developed, and satellite images showing aircraft matching MH370's configuration at Diego Garcia both before and after the disappearance. Then he made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would make sure this information reached people who could act on it. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb died in what Everett police described as a single-vehicle automobile accident. His car had left the road during clear weather conditions, striking a tree at an angle that investigators found difficult to explain. The accident occurred on a stretch of highway that Webb had driven safely for 15 years, less than 2 miles from his home. I kept my promise. The first piece of alleged MH370 debris was discovered on July 29, 2015, on Réunion Island, a French territory in the Western Indian Ocean, roughly 2,300 miles from the aircraft's presumed crash site. The fragment was identified as a flaperon, a movable control surface from the aircraft's wing. Malaysian authorities, French investigators, and Boeing representatives confirmed that the part had come from MH370. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Oceanographic analysis suggested that debris from a crash in the southern Indian Ocean would take between 12 and 18 months to reach Réunion Island, carried by the South Indian Ocean Gyre current system. MH370 had disappeared 16 months earlier, exactly within the predicted time frame. The timing seemed to confirm the official crash location. What didn't make sense was the condition of the flaperon. Marine biology experts who examined the fragment found barnacle growth patterns that were inconsistent with continuous ocean exposure. The barnacles were too mature for the time supposedly spent in the water, but their distribution suggested periods of exposure to different water temperatures and salinity levels. Some marine growth appeared to have been scraped away, then regrown under different conditions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a marine biologist at the University of Cape Town who was not part of the official investigation, published an independent analysis of photographs from the flaperon examination. Her conclusions were startling. The barnacle evidence suggested the debris had been exposed to multiple marine environments over different time periods, as if it had been moved between different oceanic regions before finally washing ashore on Réunion. The growth patterns we observed are consistent with the fragment being stored in controlled saltwater conditions, then introduced to open ocean currents much more recently than the official timeline suggests, Dr. Mitchell wrote in a peer-reviewed paper that was published, then mysteriously retracted 6 weeks later without explanation. But the flaperon was only the beginning. Between 2015 and 2018, more than 30 additional pieces of debris allegedly from MH370 were discovered along coastlines in Mozambique, Madagascar, South Africa and Tanzania. The fragments included wing flaps, interior panels, engine cowlings, and personal items belonging to passengers. Each discovery seemed to reinforce the narrative that MH370 had crashed in the southern Indian Ocean, its wreckage scattered by currents across thousands of miles of coastline. However, when I obtained copies of the detailed forensic reports on these fragments, reports that were not released to the public, I found patterns that suggested a very different explanation. Several fragments showed tool marks indicating they had been deliberately separated from larger structures, rather than torn away by impact forces. Cut marks were straight and clean, inconsistent with the ragged edges that would result from high-speed collision with ocean surface. Some fragments showed evidence of freshwater exposure, mineral deposits and corrosion patterns that could only result from prolonged contact with non-oceanic water sources. Most significantly, isotope analysis of barnacles found on multiple fragments revealed that they had been exposed to water with chemical signatures characteristic of lagoons and enclosed bays, not open ocean environments. The isotope ratios were consistent with water found around coral atolls, formations like those surrounding Diego Garcia. I began to map the discovery locations and timing of debris finds. What emerged was a pattern that followed shipping routes and naval exercise areas used by American and British forces operating in the Indian Ocean. Several fragments were discovered within days of documented US Navy operations in the same coastal regions. In October 2017, I obtained satellite imagery showing US Navy submarines surfacing in the international waters off Mozambique, approximately 48 hours before local fishermen discovered wing fragments on a nearby beach. Similar patterns emerged for discoveries in Madagascar and Tanzania. Naval activity followed by debris finds, with timing that suggested coordinated placement rather than natural drift patterns. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A former US Navy diver contacted me through encrypted channels in early 2018, claiming he had participated in what his superiors described as deep water salvage training exercises in the Indian Ocean during 2016 and 2017. The exercises involved deploying aircraft debris from submarines at predetermined locations, then monitoring how currents and weather would affect the fragments' movement toward nearby coastlines. We were told it was environmental research, the diver explained during a conversation that I cannot record or document. Something about tracking ocean currents for climate change studies, but the debris we were dropping wasn't generic test materials, it was airplane parts, some of them with identification numbers that had been partially removed or altered. The diver provided GPS coordinates for several drop sites that corresponded exactly with locations where MH370 debris was later discovered. He also described seeing aircraft fragments stored in sealed containers aboard submarines, fragments that showed evidence of controlled saltwater exposure designed to simulate long-term ocean drift. They had marine biologists on the operation, he said, scientists who were cultivating specific types of barnacles and algae, then attaching them to the debris before we dropped it. Everything was designed to look like it had been drifting in the ocean for exactly the right amount of time. The debris discoveries that had seemed to confirm MH370's fate were, in fact, an elaborate deception, designed to maintain the illusion that the aircraft had crashed. Someone had been systematically planting evidence across thousands of miles of coastline, using military resources and scientific expertise to create a false narrative that would satisfy international investigators and grieving families. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. In March 2019, exactly 5 years after MH370's disappearance, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on standard paper with no identifying marks or metadata. The image showed the interior of what appeared to be a military maintenance hangar, with concrete floors, overhead cranes and industrial lighting. In the centre of the frame, partially covered by camouflage netting, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Boeing 777. The aircraft's tail number was not visible, but I could make out distinctive features that matched MH370's configuration. The specific antenna array pattern, the unique winglet design, even scuff marks on the fuselage that corresponded to photographs I had seen of the original aircraft. But what made my hand shake as I examined the image was the background. The hangar's architectural features, the distinctive coral aggregate concrete, the industrial equipment visible in the frame. All of it matched technical specifications I had obtained for maintenance facilities at Diego Garcia. This photograph had been taken inside one of the most secure military installations on Earth, showing an aircraft that the world believed had been destroyed in the Indian Ocean. I spent weeks trying to authenticate the photograph, consulting with experts in digital forensics, aviation identification, and military architecture. Every analysis confirmed what I already knew in my heart. This was MH370, alive and intact, 5 years after its supposed destruction. The implications were staggering. If the aircraft had been preserved rather than destroyed, it meant the passengers might still be alive, held in facilities that existed outside any legal jurisdiction. It meant the debris discoveries were part of an ongoing deception designed to prevent search efforts from focusing on the aircraft's actual location. Most importantly, it meant the operation was still active. Ghost Protocol technology was not just a failed experiment, but a deployed capability being used for purposes I could only imagine. I began making copies of all my research, preparing to release everything through multiple channels simultaneously. I contacted journalists, former colleagues, and documentary filmmakers who might be able to reach audiences that government officials would prefer to keep uninformed. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April 2019, 2 men in dark suits knocked on my door. They identified themselves as FAA investigators, though they carried identification that I couldn't verify through any official channels. They confiscated my computer, my files, my backup drives, and every piece of physical evidence I had collected over 5 years of investigation. They explained that my research had been deemed potentially harmful to ongoing aviation security measures, and that my findings were being classified under provisions of the Patriot Act. I was ordered to cease all investigation activities related to MH370 to avoid contact with media organisations and to report any attempts by foreign agents to recruit me for intelligence purposes. The men were polite but clear about the consequences of non-compliance, prosecution under the Espionage Act with penalties including life imprisonment. 3 days later, I found a small package in my mailbox. Inside was a single flash drive with a label written in block letters. 370 wasn't the first. The drive contained satellite images spanning the past decade, showing aircraft that had disappeared from civilian tracking systems in various regions around the world. Each image was time-stamped and tagged with coordinates that placed the aircraft at military facilities in remote locations, some in the Pacific, others in the Atlantic, several at installations I couldn't identify. But the most disturbing files on the drive were labelled with future dates, satellite images that appeared to show aircraft that hadn't disappeared yet, positioned at facilities that were still under construction. The operation that had claimed flight MH370 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic program to disappear aircraft whenever strategic interest required it. Planes carrying inconvenient passengers, sensitive cargo, or simply flying routes that could serve as cover for military operations, all of them potential targets for Ghost Protocol deployment. As I write this, I don't know how long I have before the contents of that flash drive are discovered, or before my own disappearance becomes necessary to protect the secrets I've uncovered. But I know that the families of MH370's passengers deserve the truth, even if that truth is more terrible than the uncertainty they've endured for years. Flight MH370 didn't crash in the Indian Ocean. It was stolen by the most advanced intelligence apparatus in human history, using technology that makes aircraft vanish as completely as if they had never existed. The 239 people aboard that flight became the collateral damage in an operation designed to test capabilities that will be used again whenever the strategic calculus demands it. This silence corridor that swallowed MH370 is still active, still waiting for the next flight that carries passengers or cargo too valuable or too dangerous to reach its intended destination. In a world where aircraft can be made to disappear without leaving evidence, where debris can be manufactured and planted to support false narratives, where military technology can override the basic assumption that commercial aviation operates in civilian-controlled airspace, every flight is potentially vulnerable, every passenger is potentially expendable, the next time an aircraft vanishes without explanation, remember MH370. Remember that some disappearances are not accidents, but deliberate acts by organisations that operate beyond the reach of international law, public accountability or human conscience. And remember that in the silence corridor, the truth is whatever serves the interests of those who control the technology to make planes disappear. The sky is no longer safe. It never was. But now at least you know why.